Hi there, and welcome to MSSP 629 Research Methods and Program Evaluation. This is Module 6, where we'll be reviewing Chapter 2 of the Rossi textbook. Here are the outcomes for today. Please take a moment to connect with the outcomes. So as a result of watching today's module, we will be reviewing quite a bit of the components of a needs assessment and ending with what would be found in a completed needs assessment completed by an evaluator. So before we jump into the content, I want you to think about some of the considerations that you may have as an evaluator when aligning the type of program evaluation that we talked about in the previous module, the one right before this one, Module 5, and the informational needs raised by an evaluation sponsor. So go ahead and connect with the question on the slide and jot down your thinking in your notebook. Please hit pause at any time if you would like to stop the module and return to it at any time as you process all of the learning for today. So what are the major steps that you need to complete in doing a needs assessment? The first is you need to make sure that you have a solid understanding of the social problem being addressed. So it may be a new phenomenon, it may be an existing social problem that wants to be tackled in a different way through different programmatic structures. And once you have a solid understanding of what that social problem is, you would need to be able to describe the scope and extent to which this social problem exists. In that research, you would want to make sure that there's clarity around who the target population is, and we're going to talk a little bit about how target populations are defined in a moment. And once there's clarity around the nature of the social problem and the target population, a needs assessment would be able to describe the theory of action. So we know that this social problem exists, and it exists most prevalently with this target population. Given these factors, given what we know about the nature of the problem and the target population, here's how we could go about addressing this social problem. So those would be the specific tactics and strategies and activities that would be found within a theory of action to address the social problem. So when you're describing the social problem, you want to make sure that you have an understanding of the nature and scope of the problem, the targeted population, the context that the program already exists in, if it's an existing program, or the context that the program would be operating in if it hasn't yet started. And what I mean by context is, what factors are in place? Is there a certain policy that was just implemented that provided the funding and the guidance around what a program should look like? Is there a particular geographic setting? Is this a program that is found, will be found in a more rural environment or a more urban environment? What are some of the contexts that I think would be important to consider that could impact or present obstacles for a program's success? And that leads me into that next bullet, which is considering the factors that may impact a program's success. So what assumptions do we have? If this is a early childhood program for young students that are 3 and 4 years old, we know that 3 and 4-year-olds can't drive, right? They can't get on a bus and in many cases and go to a site that's offering certain programs or interventions. So an assumption would be that a caring adult, a caregiver, a parent, a guardian, or some family member would need to bring that child to the site to receive that program and to receive that intervention. So one assumption is that there will be a caring adult who will bring the child with some consistency so the child could benefit from that intervention. If the child doesn't have transportation, how are they then going to access the interventions? So the program may not be successful for that particular student who runs into some transportation issues. So it's really important as an evaluator to not only understand the nature and scope of the problem and the targeted population, but what factors or assumptions are in place that need to be in place for a program to be successful. And finally, removing the ambiguity to the fullest and most reasonable extent. What I mean by that is we oftentimes have data at our disposal, but sometimes the data is many years old. So at one point, we may think that this program with early childhood students in grades, they're not in grades, sorry, that are 3 and 4 years old was very successful in the 1970s. With certain activities and programmatic pieces, some of the over time, some of the needs of that population may have shifted. So we can't rely on data that is 30 and 40 years old to address more current day problems or situations. So by collecting new data, you'll be able to remove some of that ambiguity and provide clarity around who the specific targeted population is, the nature and the scope of the problem, certain assumptions that need to be in place to make sure that you're seeing success in the program. So when you think about a needs assessment, the purpose of collecting data for the needs assessment is to be able to estimate the size and distribution of the social problem over time and to identify the targeted population. Because we can't collect data on every member of a potential targeted population, you collect data from a sample. And the sample will be described in its definition in just a few slides. So a target population is the group of people, the clientele, the program participants that are intended to participate in a treatment, in a program, in an intervention. That is who you're talking about in a targeted population. So targeted populations are oftentimes similar in respects to a group that they may be a part of. So when I say family composition, you may be thinking about a 2-parent household or a single parent household. For age group, I gave an example a couple minutes ago about students that are 3 and 4 years old. You may have a population of teenagers or college students or elderly people. So there could be similar groups in terms of the family composition, age group, income level, geographic location. So we may be looking at a program that's operating in the southeastern part of the United States, for example. You also may be looking at a targeted population for a physical unit. So they may all work for the same organization. They may all work for Coca-Cola Company, and Coca-Cola Company is throughout the world. So you may need to, while that is the targeted population, when you're doing a needs assessment, you may be looking at a sample of that targeted population. And we're going to talk about the difference between a sample and a population on the next slide. So the target population is the entire set of individuals of interest, of subjects of interest. So this target population here could be all of the employees of Coca-Cola, versus a sample would be a subset of that target population. So while we can't do a survey of every single employee who works for Coca-Cola, we can pull a small subset, a small sample from that population. So sampling involves selecting a group for a study from the population being examined, of the population of interest. So in practice, conducting a sample could be, if you have 100,000 employees, you could pull every seventh random employee from a list. And then that way, everyone has an equal chance of being selected in some kind of random assignment. So we've talked a little bit about what a needs assessment is, how you have to go about describing the nature and scope of the problem, how you need to identify the target population, and then the set of that population, also referred to as a sample. Now, when you think about it through the lens of conducting a needs assessment, there are two major stages involved in collecting data. The first stage of a needs assessment is more exploratory in nature. You might know that this social problem exists, but you don't know enough about it to begin creating a survey to ask the sample certain questions. So instead, you may do a few interviews or a focus group with participants to get to know a little bit more about this social problem from their perspective. So interviews and focus groups are a great way to collect some of that qualitative data. Once you've collected that in that initial stage, it may be time to use some of that information that you got from an interview or a focus group participant and build on those findings to create a survey to take a deeper dive with a larger sample of the targeted population. This information will give you some reliable findings about the extent and distribution of the problem among the sample. And the goal with creating a sample is that once you generate as many findings as possible from that sample, as long as that sample is representative, you would be able to make some judgments about the larger population. So what are some examples of qualitative data that you could utilize in that exploratory phase of a needs assessment? Focus groups, interviews with key informants, and snowball sampling. Snowball sampling is an excellent tool. What this is you interview your friend Sally, and Sally is in your targeted population. And as you're talking more and more about this social problem, Sally says, you know what, you need to talk to my friend Diane. And then Diane is able to get in contact with you because of your conversation with Sally. So by snowball sampling, you're beginning to be able to utilize your participants not only for the information that they'll be open enough to share with you, but they may be able to put you in contact with similar participants who meet that same demographic. When you think about quantitative data, some things that come to mind are those large-scale sample surveys that were referenced in the textbook that are listed here. Please keep in mind that surveys can be administered in a number of different ways, online, in the mail, over the phone, and they may include some open-ended questions that will allow you to collect both quantitative and qualitative data. And then other forms of quantitative data include your administrative data that could be collected from organizations that have been also addressing this social problem, or potentially if the program is already in existence, you could utilize some of you could obtain data from the already existing program. So the result of doing a needs assessment is to gather as much information about the nature and scope of a social problem, as well as information about the targeted population. And once you go through those two stages of data collection, if you have to collect new data or utilize existing data, the end result will be creating a needs assessment that adequately describes the social problem, the targeted population, the scope of the social problem, factors that are impacting this problem, any of the relevant stakeholders who have a vested interest in the outcomes of the needs assessment, potential activities that could be undertaken or already being undertaken to address the problem, also known as your theory of action, and leveraging available information that may already exist. So you could have previous research, you could look at policies in place to address the social problem, and available reports and evaluations of similar programs. So as you consider all of this, Please think about a program that you are aware of and what types of qualitative data have been or could be collected from the target population, as well as what types of quantitative data have been or could be collected from the targeted population. Take a few moments to reflect on those two questions, and please let me know if you have any questions.